The Prince by Niccolò Machiavelli. A sleepy summary. Close your eyes for a moment if you like, or just let them go soft and heavy at the edges, and imagine a quiet room in Florence, a long time ago, candle burned low, a tired man at a wooden desk with ink-stained fingers. His name is Niccolò Machiavelli, and he has just been pushed out of the government he loved, sent away from the city to a small farm in the hills, where the days are slow and the nights are long, and there is nothing to do but think. And in the evenings, after the farm work is done, he puts on his old formal robes, the clothes he used to wear when he sat among ambassadors and princes, and he sits down at his desk to write, because even though he has lost his place in the world, he still has this one gift, this understanding of power, and he wants someone important to notice him again. So he writes a book, a small book, and he decides to give it to a young prince of the powerful Medici family, hoping it will win him back a little favor, a little place in the world. He calls the book simply The Prince, and it does not read like other books of its time. It does not tell you how princes should behave in some perfect, imaginary world. It tells you, in a low, steady, almost weary voice, how princes actually behave, how power is actually won and actually kept, in the real world, the tired, complicated human world, and that is why all these centuries later, people still read it before they sleep, turning its pages slowly, nodding along in the dark. So let yourself drift down into it now, the way you might drift down into a warm bath, and let Machiavelli's quiet voice carry you through. He begins, gently, by telling us that all the states, all the countries, all the powers that have ever held dominion over people have always been either republics or principalities, and since he has written elsewhere about republics, here he will speak only of principalities, of lands ruled by a single prince. And principalities themselves come in two kinds, he says, soft as a lullaby, those that are hereditary, passed down like an old family ring from father to son for generations, and those that are new, freshly conquered or freshly built, sometimes entirely new, sometimes added on like a new room to an old house. And the new ones, he says, are either completely new, ruled by a prince who was not born to rule at all, or they are like limbs grafted onto an old established body, joined to the hereditary state of the prince who has acquired them. And within the newly acquired ones, some people are used to living under a prince already, familiar with obeying someone, and some are used to being free, used to their own laws and their own liberty. And this difference matters enormously, though we will come to that slowly in its own time. Let's rest first on the hereditary principalities, because they are the easiest, the gentlest to hold. Imagine a prince born into a family that has ruled for generation upon generation. The people are used to that family's rule. It is woven into the fabric of ordinary life, like the shape of the hills around a village, like the sound of the church bells. Such a prince, Machiavelli murmurs, need only take care not to overturn the old customs, need only bend a little with events as they come, and he will keep his state easily, because the natural love the people have long held for his family acts like a great cushion beneath him, softening any small mistakes he might make. Even a prince of only ordinary ability can survive there, wrapped in the warm blanket of tradition, unless some extraordinary and overwhelming force comes to tear him from his throne. And even then, Machiavelli says softly, if such a prince loses his state, he need only wait, because the moment the conqueror suffers any setback at all, the old habit of loyalty will pull the people back to him, the way a hand returns to a familiar pillow in the middle of the night. But new principalities these are heavier to hold, more restless, keeping the prince awake at night for real reasons. Let's drift through them together slowly. Machiavelli tells the story of King Louis XII of France, who marched into Italy and took Milan with almost no trouble at all, then lost it again almost as quickly, and Machiavelli, in his low, patient way, explains why. It is because when a prince acquires a new province that speaks the same language and lives by similar customs as his own people, it is easy to hold, so long as he wipes out the line of the prince who ruled there before him, and does not change the old laws or the old taxes too much. Given a little time, the new territory and the old blend together, like cream stirred slowly into dark coffee, and become one smooth, single thing. But when the new land is different in language, in custom, in habit, then holding it requires either that the prince goes and lives there himself, watching over it with his own eyes the way a mother watches a sleeping child, or that he sends colonies, small groups of his own people, to settle in a few key places, which cost him very little and offend only a few of the original inhabitants, whose scattered anger, poor and dispersed as they are, can never truly hurt him. This, Machiavelli says, is far gentler and far cheaper than keeping soldiers everywhere, because soldiers eat up all the revenue of the new province and make everyone resentful, while a few colonies barely bruise anyone at all. And a wise prince, entering such new territory, should make himself the protector of the smaller, weaker powers nearby, quietly whittling down anyone who might grow strong enough to challenge him, and should take great care that no powerful foreigner ever gets a foothold there either. Machiavelli lingers, almost affectionately, on the mistakes of King Louis, counting them out slowly like sheep for us to fall asleep to. He crushed the weaker powers instead of protecting them. He helped one already powerful ruler, the Pope, grow even stronger. He brought a foreign power, Spain, into Italy to share the spoils. He did not go and live in the new land himself, and he did not send colonies to secure it. 5 soft, heavy mistakes, each one pulling the crown a little further from his grasp, until Milan slipped from his fingers entirely, twice. Then Machiavelli's voice shifts, and he compares 2 different ways that great kingdoms are governed, the way you might compare 2 different kinds of blankets before choosing one to sleep under. Some kingdoms, like the Ottoman Empire of the Turk, are ruled entirely by one single lord, with all others merely his servants, appointed and moved about at his pleasure, so that it is very hard to conquer such a kingdom, since there is no discontented nobleman within it to invite you in and help you, everyone owing everything to the one sultan alone. But once conquered, such a kingdom is very easy to keep, because there is no other noble family with old roots to rally the people back to rebellion. Other kingdoms, like France, are ruled by a king surrounded by a great many hereditary nobles, each with their own lands, their own followers, their own old loyalties among the people, so that it is easier to find a disgruntled nobleman to help you break in, but far harder to hold onto afterward, since so many little rival flames of old loyalty keep flickering back to life. Alexander the Great, Machiavelli reminds us softly, conquered the whole empire of Darius, which was of the first kind, and after Alexander died, his kingdom stayed peacefully in the hands of his own successors, with barely a ripple of rebellion, precisely because it had that single, unified structure to begin with. Now let your mind settle on the question of cities and principalities that were once free, used to governing themselves under their own laws, before a conqueror came along. Machiavelli says there are only three real ways to hold onto such a place. The conqueror can go and live there himself. He can allow the people to keep their own laws, taking tribute from them and setting up a small friendly government of a few loyal citizens to keep it stable. Or, and here his voice grows plain and unflinching, he can destroy it. Because a city that has known freedom, that remembers what it was to govern itself, will never truly rest as long as it lives, and given the smallest opportunity, given the smallest crack of hope, it will rise up again, the memory of liberty and its old institutions burning quietly beneath the surface like embers that never quite go cold, no matter how much time passes, no matter how kindly the new ruler behaves. Rome, Machiavelli reminds us, had to destroy Carthage and Numantia and Capua completely in order to hold them, and Pisa, even after 100 years under Florentine rule, never stopped dreaming of its lost freedom. Now gently, we come to the princes who rise by their own strength and their own quality, their own virtue, that wonderful, hard-to-translate word that means something like skill and force of will and capacity all wound together. Machiavelli names Moses and Cyrus and Romulus and Theseus, men who founded entirely new states, new orders through their own extraordinary ability, though he pauses to say that Moses, being an instrument of God, should perhaps be regarded with special reverence and not compared too closely to the others. Yet even so, the grace that made Moses worthy to speak with God was itself a kind of virtue worth admiring. What made all of them great, he says, was not fortune so much as the opportunity fortune gave them, an opportunity that let them show what they could do. The Israelites, enslaved and scattered, gave Moses his chance. The Persians, discontented under the Medes, gave Cyrus his. And having risen through their own strength, rather than being handed power by someone else, such princes find it hard to rise, but easy, once risen, to hold on to what they've won, because they know how to arm themselves, how to build new institutions on solid ground, how to compel obedience where persuasion fails. And here Machiavelli offers one of his quiet, chilling little truths, the kind that makes you go very still in the dark. All armed prophets have conquered, he says, and all unarmed prophets have come to ruin, because people are fickle, easy to persuade of a new idea, but hard to keep persuaded. And so you must be able to force them to believe once persuasion runs out. He mentions the friar Savonarola, the fiery preacher who once ruled Florence with his sermons alone, and who fell the moment the crowd stopped believing him, because he had no army, no force, nothing but words, and words alone cannot hold a state together once the enchantment fades. Now Machiavelli's voice grows more animated, more absorbed, the way a storyteller's voice grows when they reach their favorite character. Because now we come to the princes who rise not through their own strength, but through the strength or the favor of others, or through simple fortune. And here he gives us, almost lovingly, the long, dramatic tale of Cesare Borgia, whom everyone at the time called Duke Valentino. Cesare's rise, Machiavelli explains, rested entirely on the fortune of his father, Pope Alexander VI, who used every trick of church politics to carve out a state in the Romagna for his son to rule. Such fortune-built princes, Machiavelli warns, usually hold their new power only so long as the person who gave it to them still lives and still favors them, because they have not built the deep roots, the loyal soldiers, the strong laws that could support them once that support is withdrawn. And the moment fortune turns her back, as she always eventually does, they discover they have no foundation of their own to stand on. But Machiavelli says, his voice warming with something like admiration, Cesare Borgia was different, because Cesare understood exactly what needed to be done to build something lasting even out of borrowed fortune. And he did everything a wise and able man could possibly do to secure himself against the day his father's favor would end. Let the story settle over you slowly. Cesare first cleared his new territory of Romagna of its old cruel, disorderly rulers, and finding it wild and full of banditry, he placed a harsh, efficient minister named Ramiro de Orco in charge, giving him total power to restore order, which Ramiro did quickly and brutally until the land was calm again. But Cesare knew that such harsh methods, however necessary, would leave the people hating him, so once order was restored, he had Ramiro seized and cut in two, and left in the public square one morning, along with the bloody knife beside him, so that the people, staring at the gruesome sight, would feel both horror and a strange, satisfied relief, believing that the cruelty had come from Ramiro alone, and that their new prince was in fact their protector, cleansing the cruelty away. It is a terrible little scene. Machiavelli tells it without flinching, and without approving either, exactly, simply as a fact, a lesson, that harsh things, if they must be done, are best done quickly, all at once, so the wound can heal rather than dribbled out slowly, which only prolongs the pain and multiplies the resentment. Cesare also worked carefully to win the friendship of the Romans, the smaller neighboring lords, hoping to neutralize the college of cardinals who might elect a future pope hostile to him, and he took care to secure himself against the various factions of the Orsini and Colonna families, powerful Roman clans who could otherwise topple him. Machiavelli tells, in his slow unfolding way, of the treachery at Sinigalia, where Sessia lured several treacherous captains who had plotted against him into a friendly meeting, and then had them quietly strangled, removing his enemies in one clean, decisive stroke rather than letting the danger fester. And by the end, Sessia Borgia had thought so far ahead, planned so carefully, that Machiavelli says the only thing that finally undid him was something almost impossible to plan for. The sudden death of his father and Sessia's own sudden, grave illness, happening at exactly the same terrible moment, so that when the old Pope died, Sessia himself was too sick to act, unable to seize the advantage he had spent years preparing for, and by the time he recovered, his enemies had elected a pope hostile to him, and everything unraveled. And Machiavelli, almost sighing, says that anyone who thinks it necessary to study how a new prince ought to act could find no better example than Sessia Borgia, whose only true failure came from an extraordinary and almost unrepeatable stroke of bad luck. Rest here a moment. Let the candle gutter low. We move on. Machiavelli speaks next, briefly, more bluntly, of those who climb to power through wickedness alone, through outright crime, naming Agathocles of Sicily, a potter's son who rose through the ranks of the army to become ruler of Syracuse, and who seized his power by inviting the entire Senate and the richest citizens to a meeting, and then having his soldiers slaughter them all in a single morning. Such methods, Machiavelli says, plainly, without softening it, can win a prince power, but they cannot win him true glory, and there is a difference. He insists gently but firmly between cruelty well used and cruelty badly used. Cruelty is well used, if such a word can even apply to cruelty at all, when it is done all at once, out of genuine necessity, and then stopped, converted as quickly as possible into policies that benefit the people, so the wound closes and the memory fades. Cruelty is badly used when it is scattered thinly across many years, never quite stopping, so that the people live in constant low fear and constant low resentment, a wound that never heals, always reopened. A prince who chooses cruelty, Machiavelli murmurs, must strike hard and once, and then turn immediately to kindness, because injuries should be done all together, so the taste of them is less bitter, while benefits should be given little by little, so that they may be savored longer. Then, softer again, he speaks of what he calls the civil principality, the case of a private citizen who becomes a prince not through crime or force, but through the favor of his fellow citizens, either the favor of the nobles or the favor of the common people. And here Machiavelli offers a piece of advice that feels almost like a secret whispered close to the ear. It is far safer, he says, to be raised up by the people than by the nobles, because the nobles want to oppress the people and expect to share in the ruling, wanting to be treated as equals, while the common people want only not to be oppressed, and so their desire is easily satisfied, and they make a far more loyal, far more grateful foundation for a prince's rule. A prince who rises through the nobles finds himself surrounded by men who consider themselves his equals, hard to command, and always ready to abandon him for a better offer, while a prince who rises through the people finds himself alone at the top, with no rivals beneath him, standing on solid, simple, grateful ground. Now Machiavelli pauses to consider how one might measure the true strength of any given state, comparing, in his methodical, sleepy way, princes who have enough resources and enough men to meet any enemy in open battle, needing only to defend their own walls, against smaller princes who can never hope to meet an enemy in the field and must always rely on the strength of their fortifications and the goodwill of their people to survive a siege. Strong walled cities, well provisioned, well loved by their own citizens, are very hard to take, he says, and any invader who besieges such a place for too long, far from home, tends to grow tired and discouraged and drift away before the walls ever fall. Then, in a slightly different tone, almost a little playful, a little wry, Machiavelli turns to ecclesiastical principalities, meaning the states of the church, the lands ruled by the Pope, and he says these are curious among all principalities because they are sustained not by armies, not by the usual concerns of a secular prince, but by the ancient, deep-rooted institutions of religion itself, so powerful and so long established that they hold together no matter who is pope and no matter how that pope behaves. Such princes, he says, almost amused, have states yet do not need to defend them, subjects yet do not need to govern them, and their states, though undefended, are never taken from them, and their subjects, though ungoverned, do not care and do not even think of trying to escape their rule. He speaks briefly of Pope Alexander VI, who first showed how much a pope with money and soldiers could achieve, and Pope Julius II, who built upon Alexander's foundation and expanded the temporal power of the Church even further, so that by the time Machiavelli is writing, the papacy has become a genuine power among the powers of Italy. Now Machiavelli's voice grows a little firmer, a little more urgent, the way a voice does when it reaches something the speaker feels very strongly about, and he turns to the question of armies, of soldiers, which he says are the very foundation beneath every princely state, because, he tells us, plainly, there is no good law without good arms, and where there are good arms, good laws generally follow. And he divides armies into kinds, the way you might sort laundry before sleep. There are one's own native soldiers, there are mercenaries hired for money, there are auxiliary troops borrowed from another power, and there are mixtures of these. And he is fiercest, most awake, most insistent on the uselessness and the danger of mercenaries. Mercenary captains, he says, are either skilled or unskilled. If unskilled, they will simply lose your wars for you, and if skilled, they become dangerous themselves, because they will always be looking to their own advancement, either by oppressing you if you're the one paying them, or by disobeying you the moment it does not suit them, since they have no true loyalty and no true love for your cause, only love for the wages you pay, which is never enough of a bond to make men risk their lives for you in earnest. Machiavelli, remembering the sorrowful recent history of Italy, torn apart by exactly this weakness, mercenary armies switching sides, losing battles through cowardice or negligence or simple lack of commitment, says with a kind of tired, bitter clarity that Italy's long ruin came precisely from relying so long on mercenary arms instead of building its own. Auxiliary troops, borrowed from a more powerful neighbor to help you fight your own war, Machiavelli warns, are even more dangerous than mercenaries in a way, because though they may indeed be brave and well-disciplined, being another prince's own soldiers, if they win, you are now in the debt of the very power who lent them, exposed to their goodwill, and if they lose, you are ruined outright. Either way, you have handed your own fate into someone else's hands. He tells, briefly, how Cesare Borgia himself learned this lesson, first relying on French auxiliaries and finding them unreliable, then hiring mercenaries and finding them dangerous, and only truly secure once he had built and armed his own native soldiers, loyal to him alone. A wise prince, Machiavelli insists, his voice as close to passionate as it gets in this quiet little book, must have no other aim, no other thought, no other art, but the art of war, its organization and its discipline, because this is the only art expected of one who commands, and it is the thing that keeps a prince not just in power but respected, while a prince who thinks more of his own comfort than of arms loses his state, since a well-armed populace makes for a proud and free people, while a disarmed populace makes for a fearful, dependent, easily conquered one. And even in peacetime, Machiavelli murmurs, a wise prince should never let his mind rest from the exercise of war, keeping his body trained through hunting, learning the shape of the land, the rivers and the mountains and the valleys, so that he understands terrain, and exercising his mind by studying the deeds of great men from history, reading how they conducted themselves in war, examining the causes of their victories and their defeats, so as to avoid the same mistakes and imitate the same successes. In the same way that Alexander the Great imitated Achilles, and Caesar imitated Alexander, and Scipio imitated Cyrus, each great man studying the ones before him, learning from their example, carrying their lessons quietly forward like a lantern passed hand to hand through the dark. Now drift with me into the heart of the book, the part everyone remembers best, the part where Machiavelli sets down his most startling, most famous, most quietly unsettling ideas, the part about the personal qualities of a prince. He begins by saying, almost apologetically, that so many writers before him have imagined perfect republics and perfect princedoms that never existed and never could exist, but he intends instead to write about the effectual truth of things, the way things actually are, rather than the way they are imagined to be, because a man who insists on always doing what is good in a world full of so many who are not good will soon be ruined rather than preserved. And so, he says, a prince who wishes to maintain his position must learn how not to be good, and to use this knowledge or not use it, according to necessity. This is the line that shocked so many readers over the centuries, the line that gave us the word Machiavellian, but read slowly, in the quiet dark, it sounds less like villainy and more like a tired, clear-eyed observation about survival. He walks through several pairs of opposite qualities, weighing them softly against each other. Should a prince be generous or stingy? Machiavelli says that a reputation for generosity seems admirable, but if a prince truly practices generosity, spending freely to maintain that reputation, he will eventually exhaust his treasury and be forced to tax his people heavily to refill it, which will make the people hate him, the very opposite of what generosity was meant to achieve. Whereas a prince content to be thought stingy, spending carefully, will over time be seen as generous after all, since his careful spending lets him wage war and undertake great projects without crushing his people with taxes, so that his quiet frugality becomes, paradoxically, a kind of true generosity toward the many, even as a few complain that he is not generous toward them personally. Better, Machiavelli murmurs, to be thought a little stingy and rule well, than to chase a reputation for generosity and rule badly. Should a prince be cruel or merciful? Here Machiavelli offers one of his most famous, most gently devastating passages, wondering aloud whether it is better to be loved or feared, and concluding in his careful, weighing voice that it would be best to be both. But since that is difficult, since love and fear rarely combine easily in the human heart, it is much safer to be feared than loved, if a prince must choose only one. Because, he explains, love is held together by a bond of gratitude, and men, being generally ungrateful, fickle, deceptive, and self-interested, will break that bond the moment it benefits them to do so, whereas fear is held together by a dread of punishment, which never fails, because it depends on the prince's own power rather than on the goodwill of others. Men, he says, are less hesitant to harm someone who makes himself loved than someone who makes himself feared, because love is a bond that men, being wicked, will break whenever it serves their advantage, while fear is preserved by the dread of punishment, which never abandons them. But and here his voice grows careful, almost cautionary. A prince should be feared in such a way that even if he does not win love, he avoids hatred, because a prince can very well be feared and not hated at the same time, and this he achieves above all by not touching the property of his citizens or their women, since men, Machiavelli notes with a kind of weary, worldly honesty, forget the death of a father more quickly than the loss of their inheritance. Should a prince keep his word? Here comes another of the book's most quoted, most quietly startling turns. Everyone knows, Machiavelli says, how praiseworthy it is for a prince to keep faith and live with integrity rather than cunning. Yet experience shows that the princes who have achieved great things are those who cared little for keeping their word, and who knew how to manipulate the minds of men through cunning, and who, in the end, overcame those who relied on honesty alone. A prince, he explains, must know how to act like a beast as well as a man, and among beasts, he should imitate both the fox and the lion, since the lion cannot defend himself from traps, and the fox cannot defend himself from wolves. One must be a fox to recognize traps and a lion to frighten away wolves. And a wise prince, he says, cannot and should not keep his word when doing so would be to his disadvantage, and when the reasons that made him promise no longer exist, though he must always know how to disguise this nature well, to be a great feigner and dissembler, because men are so simple, so absorbed in their immediate needs, that a deceiver will always find someone willing to be deceived. He offers the Pope Alexander VI again, gently, almost admiringly, as a man who never did anything else but deceive, and who found the world always ready to believe him anyway, because he understood this one particular corner of the human heart so well. And Machiavelli adds, softer now, almost like a secret passed under the blankets, everyone sees what you appear to be, but few truly know what you are, and those few dare not oppose the opinion of the many, who are dazzled by appearance and by the outcome of things, and in the actions of all men, especially princes, where there is no higher court of appeal, everyone looks only to the result. He speaks, too, of avoiding contempt and hatred, saying that a prince becomes hated chiefly by seizing the property or the women of his subjects, and becomes despised by being seen as fickle, frivolous, effeminate, cowardly, or irresolute, and so a prince should strive to have his every action carry a mark of greatness, spirit, and strength, so that his subjects hold him in a kind of reverent awe. And speaking of the great danger of conspiracies, Machiavelli reassures in his low, steady voice that a prince who is not hated by the mass of the people has little to fear from conspiracies, because a conspirator can never act alone and needs accomplices, and those accomplices, weighing their own safety, will hesitate to join a plot against a prince who is well loved by the people, since after the deed they would have nowhere safe to turn. He looks briefly at the old Roman emperors, noting how some who seemed cruel, like Severus, managed to satisfy both soldiers and people through skillful balancing, while others fell precisely because they could not keep both the army and the common people content at once, the army wanting plunder and violence, the people wanting peace and quiet, and a wise prince must find a way to walk the narrow path between the two without falling from either side. On the matter of fortresses, whether a prince should build great strongholds to defend himself, Machiavelli says gently that this depends on circumstance, but on the whole, the very best fortress any prince can have is not to be hated by his people, because no fortress of stone, however strong, can save a prince whom the people themselves want overthrown, while a prince who is loved needs no fortress at all, the goodwill of the people being a wall far higher and far stronger than any built of stone. He turns briefly to how a prince may win esteem and respect in the eyes of the world, telling the story of Ferdinand of Aragon, who rose from a minor king to become one of the most celebrated rulers of Christendom through a string of bold, well-timed, decisive undertakings, each one building his reputation further. And Machiavelli says a prince should always show himself either a genuine friend or a genuine enemy, never remaining neutral. Because neutrality wins a prince no gratitude from either side and only invites contempt, while decisively choosing a side, even at some risk, wins either lasting gratitude from an ally or grudging respect from an enemy, and either way earns far more security than trying to please no one and offend no one. He speaks, too, more quietly now, almost drowsily, of the wisdom of choosing good ministers, noting that the intelligence of a prince may often be judged by the quality of the men he surrounds himself with, and that there are three kinds of intellect in the world. The kind that understands things on its own, the kind that understands only when things are explained to it, and the kind that understands nothing at all. And a prince may not always have the first kind of mind, but if he has enough sense to recognize good advice when he hears it, he can still govern wisely, so long as he chooses truthful, capable advisers and rewards them well enough that their fortunes are bound up with his own. And near this, a warning about flatterers, whom Machiavelli calls one of the great dangers surrounding any prince, because courts are always full of men eager to tell a prince only what he wants to hear, and a prince who listens to everyone risks being despised for having no firm opinion of his own, while a prince who listens to no one risks being surrounded by dangerous ignorance. And so the wise path, Machiavelli murmurs, is to choose a small number of wise men and give them alone the freedom to speak the truth plainly, and only about matters the prince asks of them, and then to listen carefully, decide for himself, and hold firmly to his own decisions once made, never letting himself be talked out of a good decision or talked into a bad one by the flattery that surrounds every throne. Now his voice sharpens again, briefly, as he turns to consider why the princes of Italy in his own lifetime lost their states one after another. So many great families toppled in his own memory, and he says the fault lay above all in their common weaknesses. Relying on mercenary soldiers instead of their own, failing to keep the people either loyal or properly secured, and failing to know how to defend themselves as strong princes should, each of these failures compounding the others, until whole dynasties crumbled almost overnight before foreign invaders who came prepared, well-armed, and utterly ruthless in exploiting Italian disunity. And now, softly, softly, we come near the end, to the chapter where Machiavelli turns philosophical, almost tender, considering the great and eternal question of how much of human affairs is truly governed by fortune, by pure chance, and how much lies within our own control. He confesses that he himself has sometimes been inclined to believe that fortune and God govern so much of the world that human effort can do little to change its course. And there is a strange comfort, almost a permission to rest, in that thought, but he decides, in the end, that it cannot be entirely true, because then human free will would count for nothing at all, and so he offers instead a gentler balance. That fortune is the arbiter of perhaps half of our actions, but leaves the other half, or almost half, to be governed by ourselves. He compares fortune, in one of the book's loveliest and most quietly haunting images, to a raging river that floods the plains when it swells, tearing down trees and houses, moving earth from one place to another, terrible and unstoppable when it comes. And yet, he says, When the weather is calm, people are able to build dams and dikes to prepare for the day the river rises again, so that when the flood does come, it either does not overflow at all, or its fury is channeled safely away. So it is with fortune, he says, gently, which shows its power where no organized strength has been prepared to resist it, and turns its fury exactly where it knows no dams or dikes have been built to hold it back. A wise prince, then, prepares in the calm season for the storms that will surely come. And Machiavelli adds one more thought here, a strange, bold, almost defiant final note on fortune, saying that he considers it better to be impetuous than cautious, because fortune is like a woman, and to keep her under control, it is necessary to treat her boldly, and she more often submits to those who act with audacity than to those who proceed coldly and carefully. And so, like a young man rather than an old one should meet her with boldness and daring, since fortune favors the young, who are less cautious, more fierce, and more confident in commanding her. And then, in the final pages, his voice rises just slightly out of its long, weary murmuring into something closer to real passion, real longing, as he makes his direct and heartfelt appeal to the Medici family, to the young prince he is dedicating this whole book to, urging him to seize the opportunity fortune has laid before Italy and become the one to redeem her, to gather her scattered, war-torn provinces together and drive out the foreign armies that have trampled across her soil for so many long, painful years. He speaks of Italy as more enslaved than the Hebrews were in Egypt, more oppressed than the Persians were under the Medes, more scattered than the Athenians were before their great leaders arose. And he says that just as those ancient peoples needed a Moses, a Cyrus, a Theseus, to lead them out of bondage into freedom, so Italy now needs a new redeemer, and he all but begs the Medici prince to be that man, to take up arms, to unite the Italian people under native soldiers rather than foreign mercenaries, and to free the peninsula from the barbarians who have humiliated her for so long. It is a strange and moving ending to such a cold-eyed little book, this sudden burst of hope and love for a homeland he has watched fall apart piece by piece in his own lifetime. And it closes not with more cool calculation, but with something like a prayer whispered into the dark, that someone someday might actually rise to do what he has spent this whole quiet, candlelit book describing. And so the pages end, and the candle gutters out, and the tired man in his little farmhouse study sets down his pen at last, hoping that somewhere, someone powerful will read what he has written and remember his name, and call him back from exile into the great, complicated, wide-awake world of politics and power that he loved so much and understood so well. And whether or not the young prince he wrote it forever truly read it closely, the book outlived them both, slipping quietly out into the world, copied and passed hand to hand, argued over, banned, admired, feared, and read again and again across the centuries by anyone curious enough to ask the same tired, honest question Machiavelli asked himself that lonely winter. Not how the world ought to be, but how it actually is, and what it truly takes in such a world for anyone to hold on to power at all. And now, here in the dark, with all of that gently settled into place, you can let it go. Let the fox and the lion curl up together at the foot of the bed. Let Cecilia Borgia's daring and Louis's 5 mistakes and the flooding river of fortune and the fortress that is really just the love of one's own people all blur together into something soft and formless, the way sharp things always blur when sleep finally comes for them. You know now in outline, in feeling, in the low, steady hum of it, what Machiavelli was trying to say in his little book. That power is fragile, that people are complicated, that love is comforting, but fear is reliable, that appearances matter more than most of us like to admit, and that a wise person prepares calmly in the quiet seasons for storms that have not yet arrived. Carry that thought gently with you now, not as a weight, just as a small, steady lantern glowing at the edge of the room, and let everything else go soft and grey and slow, and let yourself drift, at last, all the way down into sleep. In the end, this sleepy summary, with its relaxing tone and warm glow, is not meant to replace something. It is meant to honor and point toward a much larger light. It is offered with care, and with the genuine hope that something in tonight's listening finds its way into you as an invitation. The whole book is waiting. The real depth lives there, in every word they chose, and every story they told, and every quiet idea they let breathe across a full page. Let this be the beginning of something you carry forward in the light of an ordinary tomorrow, and if this lamp has helped you in some way, a light keeps it burning for someone else who might need it too.